Hi everyone, I'm Kelly Kivlin, Associate Curator here at DIA. It's great to see you all tonight. It's our last Artist and Artist of this season. Oh no, second to last, sorry. But we're very happy to have Nayland Blake with us. Where's Nayland? Definitely a very special occasion in terms of speaking about Beuys. We haven't had a talk on Beuys in a while. And while the work is not currently on view in Beacon, of course, we have the 7,000 Oaks installation on this street, on 22nd Street. And it's something you might walk by and maybe you already know about it. But if you don't, I do encourage you to take a look at it on your way out tonight, because it isn't part of the streetscape, or rather it is, but it's not. It is an artwork. It is something to be experienced and something to be paid attention to as a piece that is interrupting what I would say is the ecology of our street and our block. It's been in existence for many decades. At first, it started across the street when 548 West 22nd Street opened, and then we expanded on that installation years later, covering this entire block and extending onto 10th and 11th Avenue. So today we are joined by Nayland Blake, an artist, writer, educator, and curator, who will be speaking, as I said, on Joseph Beuys. Blake was born in 1960 in New York City. Their work has been shown extensively since 1990, notably in one-person survey exhibitions at Yerba Center for the Arts in San Francisco, the Contemporary Art Museum in Houston, and the Tang Teaching Museum and Art Gallery at Skidmore College, among other institutions. In 1995, they co-organized the landmark exhibition In a Different Light at the University of California, Berkeley Art Museum with Lawrence Render. And in 2018, they organized TAG, Proposals on Queer Play and the Ways Forward at the ICA in Philadelphia, which was fantastic. They're currently the founding chair, rather, of the ICP Bard MFA program at the ICP in New York. Their practice ranges from video and sculpture to performance and illustration, and unpacks the construction of performance of sexual, cultural, and racial ethnic identities. Their transgressive projects bring into focus the fraught intersections between power, intimacy, consumption, and desire. Blake has explained that, quote, they don't really see the work as a vehicle for expressing an idea about their sexuality, but, quote, as another form of practicing their sexuality. Blake's work causes us to reconcile desire with discomfort, affection with aversion, and tenderness with domination. Like Joseph Beuys, Blake has been credited with evoking a multitude of visceral responses in viewers who in turn are compelled to interrogate their relationships with each other and themselves. Blake shares with Beuys an instinct for encapsulating an ethos, for restlessness and agitation with wit, audacity, and nuance. I just want to say thank you to the New York City Department of Cultural Affairs. I'd also like to thank Brooklyn Brewery and my wonderful colleagues who assist on the series, Ashley Desserin, Sally Hughes, Max Tanone, and Andrea Villa for their assistance. Thanks so much, and please join me in welcoming Nayland Blake.
Hey everybody, wow, full room. Thank you, Kelly. And thanks to everybody for being here. I'm famously known for winging it. I am not exactly doing that tonight. I do have some things prepared, but I will probably wander off onto some tangents. So some things are written down, some things are stored up here. I just want to say that I, received this invitation, and it has been a wrestling match. Hopefully I can document some of that in the talk tonight. But it's going to be, I think, kind of light on the images, heavy on the words. So we'll get started. There we go. And those of you who know me know I'm not much of a keynote person, but I will try to do my best. So, yeah, what am I doing here? I mean, firstly, I'm giving a talk. I'm being an artist who's doing the work of an artist. I'm burnishing the enterprise of art making. You know, making it perhaps seem more credible. But one thing I should say about this talk is that it's going to contain a lot of questions as much as it is going to contain statements. So I find myself asking, you know, am I honoring a forebear? Am I acknowledging the process of influence that we all talk about in art but so rarely talk about honestly? Am I settling a score? You know, it's my thought that that works of art gain power by being reacted to. And so, am I donating my power to these works? Is that what's happening here? Am I even qualified to be here? Well, I'm an artist. But then Beuys famously said, everybody is, so maybe you should all join me up here at the podium. But one way that I've been able to sort of think about the reason for giving this talk is to try to grapple with Beuys's legacies, or various legacies, and to try to think about what legacy means in a context like this and in our present moment. So I'm going to be talking a lot about stories and about storytelling. So one of the reasons I'm here is because in one story in the mid-1980s, I began to make work like this. This is a piece from 1987. Called Insulated Pornography. It's 2 mass-market paperback books coated with wax, and then in the middle is a bunch of calla lilies preserved in honey in that jar. From the next year, there's this piece, which is called Self-Poisoning Kit. It's in the containers that you can see on the table are distilled water, apricots, and strychnine. There's a little mill to grind them all up together with, and a sort of dish, a stainless steel dish to eat them out of, and then everything sort of folds up and fits into that black box that you see there on the side. This is a piece from 1988 called It's Kiss or Kill. This is it installed at the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art in its old location. The things that you see rolled up there are Army surplus wool blankets, and the phrase is from the band X, from their song "We're Desperate." So all of this stuff is, I think, pretty clear to anybody who knows a little bit about Beuys's work, that it sort of takes on the visual language that we associate with his work. And, you know, I started working in this way in the mid-'80s when I was in my mid-20s. And one of the things that I'm thinking about in sort of thinking about an idea of influence is that we get notions of artists' voices, and the way that we sort of develop our own voice is the way that we do when we're an infant, when we understand the forms of conversation without actually having any words. I'm sure everybody has had that experience of, like, you're there with like a toddler or something and they're making sounds like they know what a conversation is before they actually have any words, any meaningful words to put to it. And I think that's the case, that's the way that we learn throughout life. We actually learn the form of things before we can actually inflect those forms with our own content. So for me, one of the things that was going on was I was rummaging through the material styles and voices of a bunch of artists that had been important to me up to that point. So I would say, you know, there was Beuys, and then whose work I actually initially encountered at his retrospective in 1979 at the Guggenheim Museum. And I want to actually just stop on that for a second, because at that point, at 19 years old, I did not have a whole lot of money, so I never bought the catalog for that show. I didn't read the critical apparatus around it. My relationship to the work was to the material stuff, was to the way that the pieces played out in that space, and the sort of thrilling nature of that installation, and how exciting it was to see work that was actually occupying that space in a compelling way. So that's the part of that show that I kind of tucked away in my head. You know, I soaked up that experience, and years later, he was one of the people that I looked to, including people like Ree Morton, Judy Pfaff, Jonathan Borofsky, and Janis Kounelis. I was trying to be fey and deep at the same time, and also to kind of mourn the death of many pals. I think one of the things that was going on in my work was that I was attempting to give a kind of gravity to the stuff that was already around me. So insulating pornography was about taking this thing that was sort of discarded and disregarded and printed on cheap paper and trying to preserve it as a kind of meaningful expression. You know, kind of literally elevating punk lyrics, and using sort of cast-off materials in a way that, in certain senses, was kind of ponderous. But, you know, in relationship to Beuys, I was really treating him in the same way that I was treating all of the rest of my mental furniture at the time. So it was a kind of grabbing at the stuff that seemed compelling to me. So let's sort of get into the thick of it in terms of Beuys as a figure. You know, I asked the question, what did he do? You could say, what didn't he do, right? Beuys was famously protean and generated drawings and sculptures and prints and photographs and installations and actions and speeches and postcards and political parties and teachings at this kind of dizzying pace over around a period of a little bit more than 20 years. But I think that there were two things that he did that were immensely important and that we're still sort of living with at this moment. First, he expanded the material possibility for sculpture. He wasn't the only person to be looking at industrialized materials or materials that we associate with manufacturing at the time that he was making work, but he certainly was the person who also then combined those materials with materials that were organic and in some ways untransformed. So his embrace of many different kinds of stuff is, opened the door to the world that we live in today, where it becomes possible to talk about any object, manufactured or unmanufactured, as potential sculptural material. But then there's the second thing that he did, which is I believe that he gave those sculptures and those materials meaning by talking about them. In doing so, he made his work storytelling as much as fabricating. One of his most famous pieces of art is him explaining art to someone else, in that case, a dead rabbit. But one of the things that's crucial there is that him as a speaker is made central in all of the work. So this idea that there's the stuff and there's the events, but then there's also the talking and there's also the stories. What's modern about Beuys is that his objects are embedded in a mythos of his own manufacture. Their meaning and much of their value comes from their proximity to his speaking, his arguing, his announcing, and his teaching. Other religious or mythic art has many voices to support it, to give it meaning, many ritual actions that reinforce its importance through regularity. Beuys's has his first, and then only the authority that other people give to it. Right? Does that sort of make sense to folks? Much of what we think about Beuys these days is conditioned by what we think about those stories, those that he told and those that are told about him. Tonight I'm going to try to think about that, the consequence of those stories, and sort of focus on two of them, one that he told and one that was told about him. And going along with this, I guess this is the part that I'm talking about as the wrestling match part of it, right? I think that when somebody tells you a story, it's helpful to ask a few questions. Ask why they need to tell that particular story. Ask what's left out of the story. And ask who's obscure, and ask who is obscured, who's being obscured. So Beuys's most famous story, and in fact one of the most famous stories of the 20th century art, is how he crashed in an airplane in 1943 and was rescued by Tartars and nursed back to health using fat and felt. So Beuys was a soldier in the German army in the Luftwaffe in 1943, and as a radio operator in his plane, he was flying a mission. The plane crashed. The other person in the plane with him died. Beuys famously said that he was atomized. And then, as Beuys told the story, he was thrown from the plane and regained consciousness with his body shattered, being taken up by these sort of local native people who brought him back to their settlement, wrapped him in felt, coated his body in fat to aid in his healing, and then weeks later he was able to return. This is a story that kind of, well, I mean, one thing we can ask is, what kind of a story is this, right? It's a story of resurrection, right? It's a story of rebirth. It's a story of, being part of a catastrophic accident, and then finding, succor with the simple people. At one point, Beuys would talk about the way that the Tartars, who he was stationed nearby, would say to him, "No, no, no, you're not a German, you're a Tartar." That was how much they liked him and how important he was to them. He could become, in this story, a figure that was both rescued and could then rescue others. So, I mean, the facts of what happened to him in 1943 have basically been recovered, and the story itself has been debunked. Beuys's version is easily seen as a fabrication at this point. But these days, we know calling something a lie doesn't diminish its power and doesn't allow us to negate the question of that I was asking earlier, right? Why did he need to tell this story in this way? What does the story hide? What isn't being said, and who's being obscured in the story? So, in '79, in 1979, I was 19 when I saw Beuys's retrospective. When Beuys was 20, he enlisted in the Luftwaffe. He fought in the war for 4 years. After his resurrection, he continued to fight until being taken prisoner by the British in 1945. None of the realities of deciding to join the Luftwaffe, fighting, killing people, returning to fight after his injury are touched on by his story. He left the fight only when captured. So, I think that one of the questions here is not whether this story is true or not, but why was this story necessary? Why was it deployed in this way, right? Quickly, let me say that, first of all, we're talking about my experience of the work being the material experience, right? Not really being around many of the sort of ideological discussions around Beuys in the late 70s and early 80s. I didn't really hear much about it. And then it became the second thing you learned about Beuys was that, well, he used to be a Nazi. Okay? Let me say that I'm the sort of person, queer, biracial, that the Nazis were very interested in wiping out, that they fought a war to wipe out. I'm sure that really doesn't extend to Hitler-Jugend and the Luftwaffe. I'm sure that they were all fine. Beuys spoke often about the force of human creativity being the basis for human freedom, and that in returning to the acknowledgement of creativity, we could, in some ways, redress the sins of modernity. In some way, he's putting forth this connection to a kind of primal past, a past of creative freedom as being the basis for democracy and political will. Novalis, who Beuys held in deep regard, speaks of a universe of shards. So a universe that's kind of broken apart into many bits. To me, that sounds like the world after World War II. It's kind of the world that he lays out in his work. And it's what we might think of as the postmodern, or what has been described as the postmodern condition, right? The question is, given all of these shards, given this scattering of stuff, given this disruption and breakage, what fills up the space between those shards? What knits things back together? And my thinking is that it's Beus's talking, Beus's narrating, Beus's stories that return meaning to the materials, that allow you to describe a stack of felt and copper as a battery, as something that, that retains power and transmits power. So all of this sort of combination of scientific language and philosophical language and mythic language is deployed to cover over the breakage that is the psychic break that exists when you've had to deal with the reality of being a soldier, right? So when you think about Beus's life, and this is the way that I try to, I've been trying to sort of get at all of this, is like thinking about the biography that we see, you know, that's kind of given to us as cultural consumers, and then we think about the life that's lived. And so I think about the one day that Beuys was in the plane crash versus the 1,200 days that he was a soldier during wartime. Right? The difference between the weight of those two things. And so what's obscured in that story is the meaning that all of those other days had. So, you know, in some ways, Beuys could only do this in a pre-internet world, right? Because the facts of the case are so readily available to us now that it's reflexive to us that we keep checking our kind of mental extensions of Wikipedia and Google search to fill up any moment of ambiguity. But in the 50s and 60s and 70s and 80s, the ability of a person to construct this tissue of fabulation was much greater. So, I guess that brings me on to part 3. So in this part, I'm going to talk a little bit about one of the stories told about Beuys. But I also want us to think about like what we're doing here, what all of us are doing here at the present moment, right? We're receiving these transmissions and we're amplifying them by handling them. That's the point, right? We appreciate the art, right? We grow it. We grow its power, we grow its, we reassert its centrality to us. We use it in part to tell our own stories. So here's, but you know, we don't have to do that. We consent to receiving, and reception completes the social life of a work of art. I mean, I'm free to make what I like, but after it leaves my hands, its value depends on how others receive it, right? So we always have right of refusal. So here's a story about Beuys told in a bunch of different ways. In 1986, a 400,000 euro grease stain by Joseph Beuys was simply mopped up in Dusseldorf. In 1973, 2 women cleaned up a baby bathtub Beuys had wrapped in gauze and bandages so they could use the container to wash dishes after an event. Another version. In 1986, Joseph Beuys' sculpture, A Dirty Bathtub with Layers of Grease on the Inside, was scrubbed clean by an employee at the Academy of Fine Art in Dusseldorf. Another version. In 1943, Beuys crashed his Luftwaffe bomber in the Crimean Mountains, where local Tartars found him and kept him warm by wrapping him in felt and grease. His subsequent use of these materials in his work was therefore highly symbolic to those who knew the backstory. But in 1986, an employee of the Academy of Fine Art in Dusseldorf took a more prosaic view of his grease-lined bathtub, helpfully scrubbing it clean. Another version. Perhaps it all started in 1986 when a grease stain by Joseph Beuys, valued at 400,000 euros, was mopped away by a cleaner at the Academy of the Fine Arts in Dusseldorf. So this story has a bunch of different tellings and a bunch of different morals, and I'll get back to that right now. Not right now, sorry, I'll get back to that later. But right now I kind of want to talk about some other things that, that are off to the side of Beuys' stories. And I guess that sends me back to one of the other reasons why I'm up here doing this. I'm a person who has often found themselves to the side or at the margin of particular things. Friends who know me sometimes refer to me as the exception. You know, it's being located on the edge of certain ideas or discussions is both appealing to me, but also leads me to ask who else and what else is on the edges. So here's a Beuys installation from 1982. Here's the Beuys home from a few years earlier. Ava Boise. born Ava Wurmbach, and she, as Beuys was an instructor at the Art Academy in Dusseldorf. She married him in 1959. So as a teacher there, she was obviously also an artist. But the only story I've ever heard about her making anything was one that she sewed the vests that he wore. But this seems unlikely to me. They had 2 children, Wenzel and Jessica, who I know even less about. Little John. So in 1974, Beuys famously made a piece called "I Like America and America Likes Me." In it, he flew from Germany to the US, was met at the plane by an ambulance that bundled him up and drove him to a gallery in Soho, where he spent 3 successive days locked in a cage with this coyote. Accounts vary as to whether or not he was there overnight. Most people seem to agree that he was there for 8 hours for each day. Some people say it was an entire week. Some people say it was 3 days. At the end of the period, he was bundled back into the ambulance and flew back to Germany, famously, as he said it, having never set foot on American soil. I call the coyote Little John because that's what Beuys called him. I don't know if he was actually called Little John or Kleine Johannes, which would probably be the German version. But here's a story that that Beuys told about the coyote. It is a special kind of secret how these Asiatic elements of, in parentheses, of American Indians came over the Bering Strait long ago. It's the same with the coyote. When I worked with the coyote, I had the idea that it's not an indigenous animal. It came as a wolf with the Indians over the Bering Strait. And this Asiatic wolf, or steppe wolf, changed his whole biological configuration and behavior. And then it was my idea to import the coyote once more back to Europe. And you could see it change back to the European wolf or Siberian wolf. It is a transformed European wolf, the coyote, how it came to the character of a brush wolf. So Beuys has got a lot to say about the coyote. I wonder about where are his stories about Ava, about being a father, about being a husband. Why are his actions so solitary? Why are arts institutions so comfortable with people without familial stories? Why is the mythic life of the coyote, which in Beuys's telling is a sort of double erasure of indigenous peoples of this continent, more interesting than the actual life of Little John? So I find myself asking the question, Beuys got back in the ambulance and went back to Germany. What happened to Little John? Where was Little John before this week spent in this experience? And I think that when we look at that story, we can see the things that are ultimately very tough for me about Beuys, because we're immediately transplanted or transported back to some bizarre invention of a European animal or a Eurasian animal that becomes a American animal that Beuys then goes and meets, and it likes him and he likes it. And so it has an affinity, but its affinity is entirely created through his narration of those two things, right? There's some speculation that some people said that this particular coyote came from out west, that it came from Texas. Other people have pointed out it probably came from New Jersey, and that it was to some extent tamed before it got anywhere near Beuys. But my gripe here is not that Little John doesn't get his due, but there's certainly that. But we sort of see the way here that actual circumstances are somehow valued only if they are treated as mythic, and actual creatures only gain their value or their artistic resonance as characters in Beuys's story. So, and I'm thinking about this particularly. I have a question about what happened in this space. Like, who was responsible for this space after both Little John and Beuys left? So I'm going to show you two pictures of artists in 1974. Here's Beuys in 1974. Here is Merle Kellys in 1974. Kellys here is washing the street in front of AIR Gallery, a feminist cooperative gallery that she was showing her work at. 5 years previous to this, she wrote a manifesto that I think is really important and sort of gets to has been really helpful for me. So I'm going to read some of it now. It is her manifesto for what she called maintenance art. So, A, the death instinct and the life instinct. The death instinct, separation, individuality, avant-garde par excellence, to follow one's own path to death, to do your own thing, dynamic change. The life instinct, unification, the eternal return, the perpetuation and maintenance of the species, survival systems and operations, equilibrium. B, two basic systems, development and maintenance, the sour ball of every revolution. After the revolution, who's going to pick up the garbage on Monday morning? Development, pure individual creation, the new, change, progress, advance, excitement, flight, or fleeing. Maintenance, keep the dust off of the pure individual creation, preserve the new, sustain the change, protect progress, defend and prolong the advance, renew the excitement, repeat the flight. Show your work. Show it again to keep the Contemporary Art Museum groovy, keep the home fires burning. Development systems are partial feedback systems with major room for change. Maintenance systems are direct feedback systems with little room for alteration. C, maintenance is a drag. It takes all the fucking time. The mind boggles and chafes at the boredom. Culture counters lousy status on maintenance jobs. Culture confers lousy status on maintenance jobs. That equals minimum wages, housewives equals no pay. Clean your desk, wash the dishes, clean the floor, wash your clothes, wash your toes, change the baby's diaper, finish the report, correct the typos, mend the fence, keep the customer happy, throw out the stinking garbage, watch out, don't put things in your nose, what shall I wear, I have no socks, pay your bills, don't litter, save string, wash your hair, change the sheets, go to the store, I'm out of perfume, say it again, he doesn't understand, say it again. It leaks, go to work, this art is dusty, clear the table, call him again, flush the toilet, stay young. I am an artist, I'm a woman, I'm a wife, I'm a mother, random order. I do a hell of a lot of washing, cleaning, cooking, renewing, supporting, preserving, etc. Also, up to now separately, I do art. Now, I will simply do these maintenance, everyday things and flush them up to consciousness, exhibit them as art. I will live in the museum, and as I customarily do at home with my husband and my family for the duration of the exhibition, right? Or if you don't want me around at night, I could come in every day and do all these things as public art activities. I will sweep and wax the floors, dust everything, wash the walls, i.e. floor paintings, dust work, soap sculpture, wall paintings, cook, invite people to eat, make agglomerations and dispositions of all functional refuse. So, I'm not saying that Kellys wrote this directly in response to Beuys, but it's kind of hard to miss the sort of assertions of utopian creativity, you know, counterposed with somebody going like, yeah, well, who's going to clean up after this revolution? Who's going to keep things running? In thinking about, you know, in thinking about having this talk, I asked Kelly to send me just sort of information on how and when Beuys entered the collection. And it seems like really the Guggenheim show in /79 was the catalyst for this. In 1980 is really when most of the Beuys work that Dia has collected has you know, entered the collection at that point. That was the moment that they decided to invest big in Beuys. At that time, 1979 to 1980, Kellys was started a project called Touch Sanitation, wherein she met with and touched every employee of the New York sanitation department, going out on their rounds, meeting with them, talking with them, and she finished every one of these encounters by shaking their hands and thanking them for keeping the city running. This led to her being artist in residence at the New York Department of Sanitation, a post that she was in until very recently. One thing I will say is that I'm, you know, in asking who's off to the side, I'm sad that I know her name and not the name of this gentleman. So that's as a result of not having access to her piece directly, but looking at it through the Queens Museum's website. So here we have people who clean stuff up, right? And we have artists. And this brings me back to the story that I started this section with in its various tellings, the cleaning lady story. So why do we need this story? Why is this story repeated so often? What's the point? What is the moral, right? Maybe the point is that cleaning people don't know value. Or maybe the point is that artists are stupid enough to value trash. Or maybe the point is art is situational, something agreed upon by transmitter and receiver. Benjamin Buchloh famously critiqued Joseph Beuys's self-mythologizing by pointing out that Beuys ignores the way in which art institutions create the circumstances that allow art to be visible, right? But what his critique ignores is the labor of people who actually make the art visible by turning on the lights and cleaning the floors and setting up the chairs and running the cameras and doing the mic check. I think much of what in order for us to make work, in order for us to make something new, we often have to incorporate a kind of forgetting. We have to kind of forget a little bit of what went before in order to at least make the stab at making something new. And so that makes me ask the question, like, what does Beuys's work ask us to forget in order for it to come into being? And how much concealing goes on in institutions of display? I mean, Beuys in part is postulating a redeeming without cleaning. His story asserts a fresh start, a resume of the a return of the mystical good parts of German culture from the flames of Nazism, an individual act. He talks about being present at a book burning in his local town, but he rescued one of the books from the fire, right? So he's the person who saved the book. I saved the book from the flames like the Tartars saved me from the wreckage of war, so I can save modern society and modern civilization through my shamanism. And maybe America, as a society, embraced Beuys right at the moment of its own bad faith, its own needing to forget, right? That its delight in Beuys and at these kind of returning mysticisms happens at the moment that we're trying to forget about our own past of racial division, of slavery and colonialism. I mean, maybe we're attracted to totalizing artists when we're at our shittiest, right? The same way that Germany will always be measured against the facts of National Socialism, the United States will be measured against the facts of slavery and colonialism. There's no country, there is no America without those two histories. And these histories cannot be healed by transcendence. They can't be healed by us having a big accident in a plane and then mystical people from native land like swaddle us up and allow us to be reborn, right? That's a kind of forgetting. That's the kind of forgetting of like why we were up in the airplane that to begin with, right? What were we doing on that flight? We were looking for people to kill. So, these histories can't be healed by being transcended. We can make all the myths we want, but we always need to ask ourselves, why these myths, and what do these myths cover? I mean, I don't need to remind people that Beuys was a Nazi to invalidate his arguments. It's enough that he professed a patriarchy that cloaked itself in universalism, that he trafficked in the kinds of erasures that are the erasures of colonialism. We must ask ourselves what we're doing when we become the caretakers of this practice, when we contribute our labor to its continuing. And so I'm just going to quickly show you a project where, in part, I tried to grapple with some of this stuff. This is a project from 2012 at the Yerba Buena Center for the Arts called Free Love Toolbox. It was an examination of the history of Yerba Buena Center's neighborhood through the lens of looking at the fate of San Francisco's first leather bar, the Toolbox, and also looking at the legacy of queer punk from the 90s. So part of this installation that happened here, part of what happened here is that the installation changed over the course of the months that it was up. This wall that you're seeing here, was designated for visitors to the show to leave emblems of things that they found represented freedom to them. So their role was to create this portion of the show by leaving stuff on display. This was the entrance to the show, which was Yerba Buena's back entrance. So basically, the way that you got in was through the back, usually the service entrance. And this wall, we basically left a bunch of markers in this hallway for people to use as they saw fit. And this is the resulting 4 months of graffiti from there. Every entranceway to the show, every internal doorway had this phrase, "Private Club 835, painted next to it. And those are taken from the entrance to the mine shaft, the mine shaft in the meatpacking district. So basically what happened here was that I asked every person on the installation staff for Yerba Buena to paint one of these next to the doorway and to sign it. So that's the signature that you see down at the bottom there. And then one of the things that we did in the show was a series of performances over and lectures over the course of the months that the show was up. And this is a performance where the audience is using ribbons and string to attach me to a banner that's on the back wall. This is my collaborator in the piece, Lolita Wolf. So just to sort of talk about like whose labor and intelligence and talent is also embodied in the piece. And so I'm not saying that this is like exactly right, but I'm saying that there is a way to sort of think consciously about how the social interactions around the things we make can have meaning without being turned into abstractions, without being distanced from or turned mythic in our narrating of them. That the actual work of maintenance is in itself valuable and as much a part of the making of meaning in our lives as anything else. So I asked Kelly to supply me with the names of the folks who work both in operations and also are the cleaning and maintenance staff at DIA. So these are them: Rendell Archibald Chad Bowen, Kurt Diebel, Heidi Gianotti, Tyrone Grant, Curtis Harvey, Emmanuel House, John Patrick Murphy, Elizabeth Peck, Jim Schauferle, Mike Senk, Tom Shannon, Dave Shelby, and John Sprague. This is the woman who I employ to clean my house, and whose labor supports and undergirds my work, Lydia Guevara. Please join me in thanking them.
Anyone? Yeah? Okay.
Hello. So, it's my impression that the large majority of value in art generally comes from a sort of societal, a sort of societal fervor, right? The only reason why we value or pay money for anything is because we collectively agree that this is something of value, right? And self-lionization has been an aspect of being an artist. I mean, as far as I'm aware. What differentiates Beuys from other artists in that sense, as opposed to the fact that he just doesn't produce things in the same manner that previous artists had?
I think that a couple of things. I mean, well, one note that I have here that I did not read aloud, but I'll put it out here, is I wrote down Beuys is Dali with taste. You know, that there's that certainly since the beginning of modernism, we start seeing artists as being structurers of their own myths. But I think that the thing that is very different in Beuys is that there's a kind of abandonment of other things that might be seen as conferring value, and a kind of almost religious appeal, like the level at which he's narrating himself as a kind of spiritual leader, is something very different than I think a lot of other artists previously. I mean, that's the word that comes up all the time, but I don't think... I think we need a more precise term, because I feel like that term gets thrown around a lot, like when we want to talk about a suspect spiritual feeling. So I think that I'm just more interested in all of the stuff that gets left out of his story. And I do feel that, like, part of the problems in a certain strain in Germanic thought is that it imagines a sort of transcendence that is profoundly dehumanizing in its ultimate effect.
Hi. This is to me. Okay, sorry. You brought up three things when you were talking about storytelling, and with particular Beuys' storytelling. And I'm sort of curious what you think maybe the difference between the three things that you brought up were, or if there's maybe a more redemptive way to look at them. You were talking about what does a story hide, what does a story obscure, which I'm sort of curious about what the difference is between those. And then you brought up fabulation, which to me seems somewhat related, but potentially a very different thing. And I just wondered if you have more thoughts on that. And maybe outside of just the realm of Beuys.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think I don't think that those things are necessarily bad, but I think that they are, maybe a way to think about it is that I use fabulation rather than lying because I want to get away from the binary of truth and falsehood. And so, you know, I think that truth and falsehood in this context doesn't allow you to get very far in terms of what the thing is doing, right? So when you ask, like if you think about something as a fabulation, or all right, it's a fable, like why are you telling me this story, right? And I guess I don't know if there's so much difference between what the story hides and what it obscures, or but I think that there is something about, like, what is the story a stand-in for? What does it stand in front of? So maybe that's the obscures part, as opposed to what it hides. What's the thing that it will not say, right? That those are kind of two different things. But I think that storytelling is a thing that we all do, and in fact, like, part of what I think of as Beuys's legacy is that in some ways we're sort of expected to do it. And so I'm thinking about the ways that certain types of stories receive a kind of reward in the context of the art world. And it's interesting to me that those are often stories that don't have ties to the everyday, like where you don't have to get up and brush your teeth, or not get to brush your teeth because the person you live with is standing in front of the bathroom sink and you have to, like, go out and get to work. It's like, that's the kind of story that doesn't get a whole lot of traction in the art world, right? But it's like the stories about, like, your own battle with depression, your dark night of the soul. That's the thing that people can sort of get with, or your overthrowing of homophobia, or that these things that are abstractions, ultimately, I think, are the things that people feel much more comfortable investing in than, like, if this is a person like everybody else, then what's the big deal?
Could you speak to the way you think storytelling or myth sticks to materials, in particular in relation to the early work that you showed of everyday things, or things that were cast aside or not considered precious, whether or not the myth making sticks to felt, or sticks to fat, or sticks to army blankets, books? Is it?
I kind of don't think it does. I mean, that's partially my point, is that it's like the relics of a saint in Catholicism, like the splinter of wood that's the piece of the true cross, has a resonance for people because of the action of so many different people attributing a value to it, not through a person telling it to you, right? Like, in all of the work that has to go into you understanding what the true cross even is, right, and why it would be important, is the way that actual myth happens. It is a thing that is a collective, and I think actually weirdly local. Like, people talk about myths like they're universal. I don't agree with that. I think they're like local stories told over and over and over again. And so, to the point that people then use them as shorthand for when they mean a particular mood or a particular, they can use them as like the kind of way of elucidating another story, right? So I don't think that any one of us on an individual level has the ability to adhere myth to a material, right? That's kind of the point of the cleaning person story, that it's like, it ultimately becomes a story about class attitude, either proletariat common sense or proletariat ignorance, you know, in the telling.
Two things. First, I wanted to say that he was a fabulist long before he became an artist, and he had all these strange theories about the Eastern man and whatever. Some of it quite educated, and a lot of it just imagination, I would say. And maybe art was really what saved him, and not the Tartars, after he had that mental break. So it is maybe a very deep salvation story that he's telling. But what I actually wanted to say is, what you think, how does his work as an environmentalist relate to maintenance? Because that is certainly a job of preservation and reoccurring care. And so I think that he was a caretaker in that sense for the world.
I agree with you, but again, I think he runs aground on the sort of macro idea of being a savior, and I kind of again point that around to Ukele's work in dealing with like actual garbage and dealing with like policy around New York City and like the disposal of waste and the stuff that is, I mean, the 7,000 Oaks stands as a kind of signifier of hope, right? And a kind of gesture of, you know, certainly changing the circumstances of Kassel. But then I came back around, like in thinking about that piece, to like, okay, but who waters the trees, and who cleans the rocks, and who, you know, that there's, I'm not saying that he was not good-hearted, but I do think that in the circumstances we're in right now, we tend to look for the big gesture when actually, like, the small gestures are the things that are going to actually save us, I think. So I believe that he left the war committed to peace. I believe that he, you know, that all of those things and his discussions about freedom and democracy, I believe that that's all heartfelt, and similarly with the environment. But I think the question for me becomes like, ultimately, whose work do I value? Or whose work needs to be amplified at this moment? And I think that's maybe a question for Dia as well. Like, I think that's one of the things that y'all are grappling with. It's like, what does it mean to have these things and to show them again? And to show them in what way? And what is their role in the culture at this point? It's not a big room. You folks on this side, you could say, you could say something.
And anybody from the other side want to chime in here?
I was wondering, because you said, and I think you did say this, that her stint as the artist in residence for the Department of Sanitation is over. Is it? In preparing this, I read somewhere that it was, but that could be wrong. I'm just curious.
I could be wrong about that.
Yeah.
But I think that it did just sort of wrap up after the Queens Museum retrospective. No? Okay, well then I'm wrong. And she's still there. God bless her.
It's a very fast question. At the beginning, you talked about artists dealing with influence honestly, and I just wanted to know if you had anything else you wanted to say about that.
Yeah, I mean, I guess when I was trying to sort of talk about, like, the thing that attracted me was the form, like the kinds of freedom that I saw in, and ways of occupying space and of structuring an experience that I saw in that show in 1979. I mean, that was an influence in the way that like a magpie is influenced by something shiny, you know, that I got very acquisitive of that. Now I'm trying to think in a very different way about like what it is that I pick up, because it's not devoid of history. You know, but I think that, I guess one of the reasons why I put in that part about people don't talk about it honestly is that we're also living in a time where a kind of ideological purity is kind of presented as safety, right? We're deathly afraid of being wrong. We're deathly, I mean, and as you know, I say that I'm more careful about what I pick up, but it's sort of coupled with this paralyzing fear of picking up or touching the wrong thing or being on the wrong side of an issue. And I don't think that that's necessarily honest either, right? It doesn't really address the ways in which your mind sifts through and chews up the material that's around you, and recombines it and re-engages with it.
Okay. Thank you, Nayland. Thank you, everyone.